you. So we heard from Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, yesterday, talking about wanting to create a lot of green-collar jobs. Do you think that this is going to be a way that he can tackle two things? One is climate change and also unemployment.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly, when you have a net zero emissions target, it's very important to put some stepping stones in place. And I think yesterday's announcement makes a clear line in the sand in terms of that commitment. But renewables alone is probably not going to be sufficient. You also need lots of other technologies as well, such as electric vehicles, potentially hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. And I think often there is sometimes tension between the environmental side and the social side of sustainability. But from what we hear yesterday and what we see across Europe, really, with the green recovery, is that actually you could end up with this win-win situation where you do get the transition towards a low-carbon economy, and at the same time, you're also helping to create new jobs.
Jess, I got to ask about wind power as well as solar power. A lot of us have just got done watching this Bill Gates documentary on Netflix where he makes the point that you simply cannot store enough power from those two forms of renewable. He thinks that clean nuclear is the only way to go. Is that a controversial opinion?
I think nuclear is clearly a type of technology that creates a lot of debate. It is carbon free, but as you suggest, there are other challenges with nuclear. What I think is exciting, though, from the renewables perspective, though, is battery and storage technology continues to be developed. The cost of battery storage is reducing. And new technologies like hydrogen as well, if they can become more cost effective, then they can also become a really important part of the energy mix and help to facilitate a higher percentage of renewable delivery.
Jessica, when we look at the commitments we've seen from big oil companies, or what would have been called big oil companies, now maybe we just call them big energy, when we look at the commitments around Scope 3 emissions, how close are we getting to a situation where they take very seriously Scope 3 emission targets and we have reliable data on which to measure the difference they're making on that front? And I'm not just talking about the big listed ones, but big oil in general.
Over the last few years, there's been a huge amount of progress with the oil and gas sector coming out with very clear narratives about the recognition to be reducing their emissions, as you say, Scope 3, as well as their direct emissions. What we now need to see over the coming years is that progress being made. So looking to invest in all types of new energy, renewables, but also some of those other technologies that I've mentioned. And you raise a really interesting point about actually the data and measuring Scope 3 emissions. There are actually 15 different categories of Scope 3 emissions. And for companies across all sectors, actually having more consistent and comparable data on Scope 3 emissions is going to be really important to be able to really assess which companies are making that progress.
Jess, I want to ask, we focus so much on the E and not quite as much on the S and hardly at all on the G. LNG, which is the biggest money manager in Britain, has recently said it's going to vote against boards that lack racial diversity. Do you think there's going to be more focus, needs to be more focused on the S and the G?
It's an interesting point. And if we look at where ESG has really impacted asset flows and asset prices, to date, the biggest amount of evidence is actually on the environmental side. But we definitely see the social elements becoming much more on the radar screens of investors that we speak to. And I think this is for a couple of reasons. I think, first of all, because of the pandemic, there's been a huge amount of focus on how are corporates treating all of their stakeholders. So not just shareholders, but their employees, their suppliers, their customers. And really assessing how the culture of the company and the inclusion of all stakeholders can really benefit the company longer term, both in terms of being an employer of choice, but also having robust supply chains, for example. The other element is on the diversity side, as you say. Diversity isn't a new topic, but I think until relatively recently, gender diversity has almost been a proxy for diversity and inclusion. And actually our own research, because of the data that's been available, we've only been able to look at gender and demonstrate that more gender diverse companies tend to outperform versus their lower diverse sector peers. I think this year, the increased focus, and rightly so, on race and ethnicity is the beginning of what I would see as a multi-year process to increase that level of focus on this issue. And what's really required as well is more data to be disclosed. And again, through data, investors can really be assessing what companies are doing.